da Siege of Corfu, yada da 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 Siege of Corfu, ba da 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 Siege of Corfu, tra la 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 Siege of Corfu, yada da 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 da. It's the Siege of Corfu. Hello everyone, how are we all doing tonight? Hope you're well. This, of course, is the much long advertised Siege of Corfu, which, how do I put this politely? Yeah, I've been thinking about doing this for a while. End up deciding, well, it's rather appropriate this time of year because technically, Siege of Corfu ended on the 3rd of March, 1799, and so it ended, being completely honest, 323 years ago, which doesn't happen that often. It's not, I hear you only have your 323rd birthday once. It's a special birthday, therefore. So this is the 323rd birthday of the Siege of Corfu. Ending. Now, when I did put this in, as said, I was hoping to have some bits in here, and maybe even a bit of a recorded video from a friend of mine who's actually Ukrainian, because they do a lot of work on this era of the Russian Navy, but unfortunately they are currently very, very busy. And so they aren't able to join me this evening, annoyingly enough. We're all hoping they're well. And so here I am doing this. But luckily, I was also helped, and there is a link down below to, well, not a friend of mine, but someone who I've certainly been impressed by the work of, and I've been following it a lot over recent years. This particular paper is all about Admiral Ushkaros and Captain Abdulkadir Beg, or, well, Abir Bey, as the Russians like to refer to him. Interestingly enough, this was the quite important document. There is a link down to it down below, where I actually found out the Ottoman commander's name. Prior to that, I'd not been sure myself. My friend kept saying it was that. But anyway, let's say hello to everyone. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Carl McGusberg. Hello, Sasha Duvachel. Hello, John Shea. Hello, DG40. Hello, Jack Ray. Hello, Dunrick. Sorry, Andrew got that wrong, Jew. On me. Hello, Dunrick Iron Hammer. Hello, Knight 6831. Hello, Alan Zaski. Hello, Jonathan Burrow. Hello, Colin Cameron. Hello, Bijon. Hello, Roland Cash. Hello, Tanavalka. Hello, Alzaski, then at top. Hello, RAF. Hello, Wayne Borean. Jack Ray, it would be funny if someone copyright claimed Dr. Clarke singing. Someone has tried in the past, but YouTube did not uphold it because they decided that my singing was sufficiently bad enough it could not constitute a copy of anyone else's singing. Viva la bad singing! Sana Canera, would a series on the Crimean War now be in poor taste? I'd love to do one at some point. Not sure if it'd be currently in poor taste. Nice turn. Frank seemed really savage and angry on this week's build prompts. Yeah, you always have to remember that's a slightly edited version, what you get. And let's be honest, it's the slightly politer version. We have the warm-up chat for about 30-45 minutes before we start recording. And he and I in the warm-up chat were not good. We're a bit upset. We're a bit annoyed that, it wasn't any of our speakers' faults. But we had been hoping to have, as said, a really good expert on, and he couldn't come, and Jamie couldn't make it for very sensible reasons. And so it was me and him. And the trouble is, when it's me and him, is we are very, very similar in our levels of sarcasm. Hello, ye early sage. Jacques Ray. Make warships not war, we try. So what went wrong for France in the siege of Corfu? Well, how do I put this politely? Don't try and resist 11 ships of... no, hang on. 12 ships of the line, 11 frigates, and 6,000 troops, plus about X 100 artillerymen, with a force of about 600. You might find you'll get crushed completely. Hello, Matt Flattery. Hello to Maryland. Hello, Andrew Mend. And hello, Grace Oholski. Hello, Derp Squad. So, hello, everyone. Right then. This is really important today. I haven't had this in several days now, and it isn't needed. So let's start off with Haida trip update. So the update at the moment is currently fundraising at £2,230, which is way beyond my initial plan or request. I had figures worked out for what would happen because, well, how do I put it? I had a dream scenario, always work out a dream scenario of how much money you need for the dream scenario, and then work it back down to what will be the still a dream but sort of basic scenario. And pretty much the limitations on costs for the trip. We've booked the tickets, we've booked the flights. They are booked in. So we leave UK for Toronto on the 3rd of June and arrive and drive to Hamilton. And then we leave Toronto for the UK on the 12th of June. Arrive back on the 13th. So we're in Canada for, broadly speaking, 8 to 9 days. Now, as you can see, the visit which is already fleshed out is Haida, filming there. Hopefully going to the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, filming that's in Hamilton as well. And Sackville, filming that's in Halifax. And Nova Scotia Archives in Halifax to look at their Atlantic stuff. And the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic to look at their stuff. Now, again, and honestly, this is me giving you an update because I think you should, as you're all being so kind, have been so kind, generous in donating the money, I should tell you what I'm doing with the money. I could never be one of those people like those big charities which take money and then don't tell people what they're doing with it. That's just not my way. So if I get any more money, there is a sort of plan of what to do on these are the other points I'd like to hit if possible while I was out there and are viable to get to. Little Rock and the Sullivans would be lovely to do. I would have to contact their museum and I'll have to see how much it would cost. Someone has already sent me Ojwa, HML for the how to pronounce that name, but I still keep mucking it up. So thank you to the person who very kindly sent it to me. I will get better. I will try and practice again. And then there's the Naval Marine Archive, which is at Picton, Ontario, and the Library and Archives of Canada at Ottawa, and the Canadian War Museum at Ottawa. All three of which would be nice to visit, but those are going to be slightly further away. These three are practically on top of Hamilton. You've possibly never heard of Hamilton, Ontario before, but if you are visiting and you want to see Haida, you want to see the Sullivans, Little Rock, Audra, all these things sit around Hamilton, Ontario, and it's a really lovely place. It's not far from Niagara. It's far enough though that it's not going to be massively touristified. Yeah, I have to admit that there are a few people who are already slightly worried about what me and Drac will get up to while out there, especially as at the moment we may have. I'm hoping that we're going to have a few nights of talks and public talks while we're out there. But if we had less of those we have, the more, of course, dinners we're going to have wandering around. Karen, I'm taking you mobile, Doc, because I need to go set up the Wi-Fi in a community center. Good luck. Oh, Cash. So, Clarke, I met an ex-Marine XR in mine disposal gent today, and in the naval chat, he mentioned to me that he had to locate the wreck of Coventry post Falklands and make it safe. He accidentally mentioned ordnance on board she should not have had and quickly stopped talking about. Such was a good sign. Any ideas what it could be? Clearly not NBC Naval, maybe? Probably not. Let's be honest. You have to consider there's the ordnance they could have on board. That would probably reflect what ordnance they could actually launch. HMS Coventry was a Type 42 destroyer, which meant she had the 4.5-inch deck gun, which I don't think there's any special ordnance shells made for her. Or the Sea Dart missile system. Now, Sea Dart, there were a range of random warheads which could have been made available, which they did look at. But I don't know exactly what those warheads might have been. Nice hearing. Why is Operation Tan 2 on next Friday? Because I promised to do it last year and then wasn't able to do it, so it's been scheduled for next Friday for about a year. So that's why if we go to quickly back to this, you will see next week we have the Battle of Agates on the 10th and the Operation Tan number 2 on the 11th. So we have 2 lives next week. Thursday and wish me luck. No. So there you go. That's the Haida update. Thank you ever so much to the people who have donated. I honestly don't know how to say thank you to you so much. It's really beyond my understanding. And something here, Buff and Naval is trying to grow its YouTube presence. A Drac collab will be great for them. Well, the thing is, and I'm gonna put this out as a sort of thing, is that I might end up going to those on my own. And the reason I say I might end up going to those on my own is Drac is going to see to Texas. So we'll wander. So at some point we're splitting up for a couple of days, and I'm not sure how long I'm going to need in Halifax. But if I think I'm only going to need 2 days in Halifax rather than 3, then I'll be back to Hamilton earlier. And if I extend the time at all, I'll be in Hamilton for longer. In which case, Drac might extend it with me and also might come back and we might end up doing those together. I'm not sure what's going to happen. But it should be quite fun. But no, some of these will be joint trips filming. Haida and Sackville will definitely be joint. And so will the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Some of these might just be me. Hi, Jim Stuff. Wayne Boring, let's keep doing, folks. Let's make sure Alex has the chat cash to buy lots of books. Yeah, and there you go. Actually, there's an interesting thing with the conversation with Drac on this one, and he is cheating in a way. No, he's not flying back his books. No. He's going to have them posted back to him. I think he's planning on boxing up a huge number and sending them back by DHS. Oh. This year going to fix the Texas? I think so. I know he's going off to one of the American ships. Ow, right then. Let's get off the topic of commentary for a second, because that's an interesting topic. And here we go. Why does Corfu matter? Well, Corfu itself is not an end. Corfu is not an end. Corfu is, we've got here. Okay, where are we going from here? And that is the point. Corfu is one of those places where it's really useful in the Age of Sail as a stopping off place, as an exchange place, as a transit place, not as a place itself. And this becomes, to an extent, a problem only when people start to assess its value. Strangely enough, we're going to be getting into the value from the French perspective at certain points, but first off, I have to look at the geography of it. Corfu is sitting at the entrance to the Aegean. It's not far from the Ionian, well, it is the Ionian Sea, sort of, and not far from the Adriatic. So it's the entrance to the Adriatic and not far from the Aegean, and it's in the Ionian Sea. It's at a nexus point in many respects. And it's actually a naturally defensible point. Although it does have a couple of weaknesses, but it is theoretically fairly defensible. And as you'll notice there from my lovely Google Maps, you'll notice I have Taranto highlighted, because that gives you a rough idea of what's going on in this area. You have the boot of Italy, you have today modern Greece and Albania and Macedonia, all sort of not that far away from each other, but at this point, you are dealing with the romping, stomping Ottoman Empire. But it hadn't been the Ottoman Empire. This had not been the Ottoman Empire. Not for a long time. This had been part of the Venetian Empire. Right up until the Treaty of Campo Formio. Now, the War of the First Coalition is one of those wars where, frankly, you're really happy you're not on any side. Because the First Coalition spends more time chewing itself up than it does actually fighting the French. In fact, the First Coalition is a bit of a frickin' nightmare. And there is never any surprise that the treaties which end it do not hold forever. But one of the treaties has a bit of an impact, because the Treaty of Campo Formio between Austria and France, yeah, the Austrians got involved, and of course the French are always involved, but, you know, the Austrians got involved. Well, that treaty kind of completely destroys Venice. And there's a reason I'm being slightly quite so funny approaching it, because the amount of parallels which have been drawn recently between the end of Venice and modern Ukraine. So let's be honest, let's go with the myth. Venice just gives in and surrenders. It isn't quite that similar. Venice is a city-state. All it has is one city. It has no strategic depth. It has been dying by 1,000 cuts for many, many years, thanks to first the Portuguese getting into the Indian Ocean. Remember, we talked about this a few weeks ago. with the Indian Ocean trade and the various things that the Portuguese got up to out there, which directed the trade instead of the flow of spices coming through the Levant up to Venice, and Venice carrying on, continuing to being the middle person and dealing with the trade. They lost it to the Portuguese, and then the Ottomans had also taken it out from their direction. So the Venetians had been cut off from their very lucrative financial means. Just to the point at which they needed to start investing money in building a whole new level of maritime infrastructure and naval forces that the infrastructure would support as it transitioned from galleys to galleons. Venice fought many wars at this point. Venice had kept fighting. By the time you get to the late 1790s, Venice has been fighting for 50-odd years, more or less, non-stop. They are worn out. By the time a huge French army appears at the gates of Venice, there is nothing left to defend Venice but the widows. Venice doesn't die because the French turn up and they don't fight back. Venice has been dying for a long time at this point, and when the French turn up, that takes it over. And here's what tells you what has happened to Venice by this point. Because the French don't even bother to keep hold of Venice themselves. They give Venice to the Austrians. The Treaty of Campo Formio on the 17th of October 1787 tears up the empire. Under its provisions, Austria receives most of the mainland domain to Venice, including the city itself. The French have taken it, but it's so unimportant to them and so not worth it that they are giving it off to the Austrians. It'd be like, again, if you want to use a modern example, it would be. No, I'm not going to use the modern example because that could just cause trouble. But it would, like in, I don't know. I'm trying to think of it. There is very little similarity of a nation just being auctioned off to a nation to another nation which was technically one of your opponents, who were technically one of the allies of that nation. Now, I'm trying to think of it. An ally basically accepting that nation as part of its compensation for the war. But the French retained one part, the Ionian Islands. Why? They call them the most valuable part of Venice. Why was it valuable? Well, these islands were to be France's gateway to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Egypt, to India, to the world. Basically, the idea was they could use them to open up the traditional trade routes through the Levant, and they could do that in such a way they would be able to circumvent or get round the British blockade. That's it. Don't know. If you have any time, maybe Oak Island. I'd like to add it onto the list. I'd say the Haida stuff, but we'll see. It's time. You're now on a 65-inch television. Hello. Hello, Zuski. Where are the fluffies of the line? Let's see. Where are the fluffs today? They have actually been. This is a strange thing. They keep missing the lives, but they have been out for the recordings, and they have been out during the day. They just keep missing the lives at the moment because they go in and stretch out on the carpet. as I see, Poland given to Stalin by the Allies. Yeah, that's a similar scenario. Potentially Calvin has meant, but Burgerland? Really? And Czechoslovakia? Yeah, it's basically it's not nice. But the point I want to make is when I hear those analyses on television of Venice, and this is not me saying a disservice to you people of Ukraine. I please don't want anyone to start going on critiquing there. Definitely not. And that's the last thing I need is that kind of Twitter storm. I don't have the energy. But the point is, it's not like the fall of Venice. It's not a case of because they fought. Venice didn't fight, so they're now forgotten, and the Ukrainians have fought, and so they won't be forgotten. It's a case of the Venetians had fought for nearly 50 years. It's kind of like people keep forgetting Ukraine's been at war since 2014. It doesn't fit in a quick narrative, so they forget it. Bergland today, but I didn't want to bring you with Obedek. So what effect did losing Corfu have on France? That's a great one. That's probably going to be the end of this one. That comes down in the legacy slide at the end. We haven't even got to the siege yet, so they've still got it at the moment in this discussion. At this point. The Fluffies are raiding the coast of France. Never doubt the chance of my Fluffies doing that. One of them's a corgi. And the other one's a poodle. The poodle will be after their cheese, the corgi will be after everything else. And I mean everything else. Seriously, that corgi's a tea leaf. So, now comes the War of the Second Coalition. And here's what I always love about the War of the Second Coalition. Whenever I find any of these decent maps which actually purport to show the War of the Second Coalition, it's so rare that they actually show any of the Russo-Ottoman campaigns on them. And here's a classic example. You have the Royal Navy running along, the Egyptian campaign even. The fact that the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire both dispatch huge forces to attack various points of French control is completely ignored. Now, the Second Coalition, of course, comprised the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, aka Austria from 1801 onwards, Great Britain, United Kingdom, after 1801, as of course. Well, technically, United Kingdoms of Great Britain, but we'll leave that to one side. UKGB. Russia becomes the Russian Empire, or something in about 1799. But they're part of the coalition. Well, no, they're still Russia, but they're Russian Empire as well until after 1799. But they're only in the war really till 1799. The Ottoman Empire are in the war for most of it, although the Egyptian Mamluk part of it are only in the war till 1798. Naples fights until 1801. Tuscany takes part till 1801. The war actually theoretically goes on from 1798 to 1802. Portugal and the French Loyalists are in it from the beginning. There is a quasi-war, of course, with the Americans during this period, and Malta is, of course, fighting, I think, alongside the British. It's quite fun. And on the side of the French, there's also the Spanish, the Polish legions, the Latvian Republic, the Cisalpine Republic, the Helvetian Republic, the Parthenopean Republic, the Egyptian Mamluks at one point, and their own republic. You'll notice I'm not mentioning the Ionian Islands and that. That's because they are technically ruled directly from France. And technically, they're ignored by everybody, because whilst they're so important that they're the only part of Venice which you actually, of Venetian Empire, which you actually want to keep, that no one actually bothers about keeping them. I mean, seriously. The French rule of the Ionian Islands is the most half-hearted, interesting thing known to mankind. Although it does start a very interesting trend. And I will say this now: if you want a good guess, which you'll be right 50% of the time, if you ever see a very difficult politician in the Greek Parliament who is really causing trouble for the government, sometimes just for just for the joy of causing trouble for the government, the odds are they come from the Ionian Islands. There is a reason for this. They start off very enthusiastic about democracy under French rule. Then they find the French are a bit annoying, as they believe in democracy, but the sort of democracy where you always vote that agrees with whenever you vote, the vote agrees with them and does what they want you to do. And that sort of annoys them to an extent, if what I can say. How do I put this politely? There's actually a gap in the wall behind me. I know, leave that to one side. The French, therefore, end up having to deal with this scenario. They end up having to deal with the reality that they believe that everyone just wants a cloak of democracy that actually agrees always with a French dictator. Whereas the Greeks, well, the Ionian population, actually believed that what they wanted was democracy where they actually got to say what they wanted to do. So problematic. Mostly, the French gentleman in charge is a gentleman called, and he's not the one in charge by the time of the battle, and frankly, I'm not that keen on him, but his surname is Gentili, Antoine Gentili, who is special. Manages to run the Ionian population and the local administration and government into the bankruptcy point, so that when the lovely Louis Francois Jean Chabot is appointed to take on charge of him and replace him as commanding general, and a general called Pierre-Jacques Bonhomme de Comres is appointed as commissioner general. Neither of them immediately goes to the actual islands to take over their posts. No, one of them basically tours France going, we need money. And the other one tours Italy going, we need money. Comres stood up a police force, or gendarmerie, and managed to establish some sort of police order and actual rule of law to an extent. Although he'd die in Ancona from an epidemic there. And Louis Francois Jean Chabot is in charge when the Russians and Ottomans turn up. and has the joy of going, Comrade Napoleon, I only have 600 troops. You will hold and win. I have 600 troops. They have 6,000. The odds are not in my favour. You are France. Vive la France. The odds will be on your side. Please can I retreat? None. You will hold. Please can I withdraw? None. You will hold. Oh, God. You know, we do make fun of the French sometimes for being a load of cheese-eating surrender monkeys, to quote the pub landlord, a.k.a. Al Murray's comedic character. But, and I say this in the nicest and most loving of ways, there are some, considering some of the places some of their leaders put them, they're not. They're just hung out to dry. And it's a case of, do you want to all be killed? No. Let's surrender. Dove's God. Napoleon believes in the concept of one man for one vote. He was the man who had the vote. Agreed. Oswald Skeets. The big fluff. What breed of fluff is he? Poodle. Standard poodle. Seneca, democracy where the population actually has a say. What a showing. To be fair, and I would like to point this out, the Ionian residents' versions, or rather the ones who got to say on it, version of democracy, was that basically the people who had money would get to vote. So it wasn't necessarily one man, one person, one vote. It was one person with enough money and income, i.e. a homeowner, etc., would have the right to vote. So, here is the joy that is the British diplomacy, and it really is a joyous thing to look at when we start talking about this topic, because the Ottoman-Russian alliance, the Russo-Ottoman Alliance shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't. They keep fighting wars. They absolutely despise each other. In fact, the admiral who's put in charge of the Russian and eventually the combined fleet, Admiral Fyodor Ushakov, actually has a memorial to the battle he'd won against the Ottomans a couple of years before the alliance had declared. It's just a case of how, in the name of all things, what? This is happening. It's one of the most confusing alliances known to mankind, because it's a defensive alliance which includes lots of secret clauses, quite standard at this point. And pretty much it's brought together by the British bribing the Russians and the Ottomans. Pretty much the British are doing Rolls-Royce diplomacy, Royal Navy officers all round, serving in the Russian Navy, serving in the Ottoman Navy, and basically trying to get everyone to work together. Yes, this is the Royal Navy's methodology. If you want real fun, then you realise that this alliance managed to last from 1799 to 1806. At which point, they go back to beating each other up again, and they're actually fighting the war till about 1812. And that's the war which, again, most famous for Admiral Kuznetsov and Kuznetsov and all sorts of things turn up, and you know, it's just there are times in life when you really do not understand how things have happened. And there are times in life you look at it and go, you're all jammy dodgers managing to pull this one off. And this is the latter. I'd also like to point out here, and this is going to be my one little bit of wandering into this topic for this evening. That is called the Russian Empire. Not Russia, the Russian Empire. And that is the Ottoman Empire. Please note, if countries make a habit of claiming all the countries which are places which they used to rule when they had an empire, i.e., when they by definition, an empire is more territory than just your own homeland. So the Russian Empire means that you control other countries as well as part of your empire. They're not part of Russia. Well, this is not a precedent that places like places should really start pushing, because there are some empires which were rather larger, and if it becomes a precedent and they start, everyone starts going, "We would like our empire back," because they're actually part of our territory, this could be very complicated for the world. That's going to be my one foray into this one today. Right. That's good. It was very rarely the French soldiers of the line surrendered. They often fought on despite all laid down arms from politicians in Paris who did surrender. Yes, they did. French soldiers were often very, very good. 603. Were the French in a decline? Not particularly. They were the French being French at this point. John Barrow. I mean, the Ottoman Russian Alliance has to leave both at them, then victory will be out. Yeah. That's what the British diplomat gets the Ottoman Russian diplomats in the room and asks, "How much to get your 200 and go to fight the British?" Said, "Yeah, that's pretty much the policy." And there's interesting conversations. At various points, there are problems, which this report, if you want to read a good journal article, the link's down below. You can get it off academia.edu. That's what I put a link in, because unlike JSTOR, normally you can get access to this with just a Gmail account. And you don't have to have usually an actual account. You don't to get access to these documents. You just need a Gmail account normally, or at least you have until we have used to. And this article has points on a Royal Navy captain turns up and does the let's put it this way, turns up and goes, "I will do the beach reconnaissance for you. I will do the charting of the waters for you. Why don't you do this, and then you can come help me actually attack the French somewhere we care about." And it has a really interesting ending. So, he is Fyodor Ushkov, and I like him. I do. He is one of those admirals who is a fairly decent one. He's born to a modest family of minor nobility in Bunakovo. His father was a retired sergeant of the Perensky Regiment. That's part of the Russian Imperial Guards. That was a special unit which is basically it was a very elite unit, and basically everyone in it, everyone in every rank had to be a noble. So being a sergeant in it was actually quite prestigious. It's kind of like, an example, the Honourable Artillery Company. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, in UK there is in London a territorial army unit called the Honourable Artillery Company. And let's put it this way. You have to be incredibly rich to be able to afford to be a member of that particular territorial army unit. It is incredibly expensive at all levels. And that is according to all reports and according to experiences of going to their dinners. Not by I haven't gone to their dinners; they're too rich for my blood. But I have joy of being a scholarship boy at some schools where there were some really rich young gentlemen, and yeah, they have gone to those dinners. Anyway, by when he arrives at the Navy for training, he says he doesn't have a coat of arms nor a royal patent for land estate, and had no way to prove his nobility. However, by 1798, he is a Vice Admiral of the Black Sea Navy, and as that, submits a request for official nobility and arms providing genealogical record. In his 1807, his coats of arms were added to the General or Russian Book of Heraldry, and in 1815, Fyodor Ushkov and his family were added to Part 6, Ancient Nobility of the Yaroslavy Genealogical Book. So basically, he did well enough that they were added in, and they had enough of a connection that he wasn't held back. He joined the Russian Navy in 1761, signing up in St. Petersburg. After training, he served in a galley in the Baltic Fleet. In 1768, he was transferred to the Don Flotilla in Tagarong and served in the Russo-Turkish War. He commanded Catherine II's yacht and was active in protecting Russian merchant ships during the First League of Armed Neutrality. After the Russian Empire conquered the Crimean Khanate in 1783, yes, Russia didn't only first conquered Crimea in 1783. Till that time, it was a completely different people. Ushkov personally supervised the construction of a naval base in Sevastopol and built the docks in Kherson, which of course has been on the news as well recently, as apparently there is a dispute over who now currently controls it. During the Russo-Turkish War in 1787-92, he defeated the Ottomans at Findosy in 1788, Strait in 1790, Pendra in 1790, Cape Kalarica in 1791. He was a very innovative commander. Okay, in 1798, he's promoted to full admiral, given command of a squadron, and told to sail to the Mediterranean via Constantinople, where it picked up an Ottoman squadron. This combined fleet would then take part in the War of the Second Coalition. He, of course, took part in the taking of the Ionian Islands, and also blockading French bases in Italy, Genoa, Ancona, and took part in assaults on Naples and Rome. He was then I was at that point, Tsar Paul, in his capacity as Grand Master of the Order of St. John, ordered Ushkov to proceed to Malta, which Nelson was at that point assisting in besieging. Unfortunately for Ushkov, he didn't get to serve with Nelson for that long, because he was almost immediately recalled back to Russia in 1800, along with his fleet, when Alexander I failed to appreciate his victories. Basically, Alexander I didn't like the fact that Ushkov was quite so successful. So he resigned command in 1807 and withdrew to the Sanskar monastery in modern-day Morodovia. In 1812, he was offered command of the local militia during the Patriotic War of 1812, but declined. During the course of 43 naval battles, according to Russian records, he did not lose a single ship and never lost a battle. This is, in many ways, the gentleman we are talking about is the Russian Nelson. Definitely a very successful officer. And just the notes, there is currently a sovereignly class destroyer, which is named Admiral Ushakov, for him. They did rename the Kirov to Admiral Ushakov, but of course then she was retired. And he was also a Stilov-class cruiser was named for him. And a coast defense ship was named after, which was sunk at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. All fun. Really, he does deserve a newer ship. That's good. If every country is getting their previously conquered territory back, a lot of people are going to have to learn Norwegian. Yep. And Swedish. And Polish. Depends. Which empire do you want to go back to? This is the other trouble if you start claiming all the territory you used to own. Who has prior claim? For example, are the Italians able to reclaim the whole of the Roman Empire? How about Macedonia? Or is it Greece that gets to claim the Greece that gets to claim the empire of Alexander the Great? You don't want to start down this route. You can end up with a lot of troubles, and then of course that's all before we start on the Mongolians. Because let's be honest, they've been peaceful for several hundred years at this point. Do we really want them to start riding again? That wasn't it. Wasn't it enough trouble last time they did? He may not have lost a single ship, but he did lose the YouTube stream. That's good. What about the Babylonians, Hittites, Egyptians? I know! It's just going to get complicated. It can all get very complicated. This is the thing. This is why historical claims to territory are not things you really want to start going back to, because it tends to favour the countries which have been around for a long time. Well, again, what level of British Empire? So, here is a little problem I have. This is probably the most accurate text available. Now, the trouble is, it has one list of ships in it, of belonging to the Russian fleet that sent that. We know the Russians send roughly six ships of the line and 6 frigates. And the Ottomans send 5 ships of the line, no, 6 ships of the line and 5 frigates. We know this. Roughly. We honestly don't know which ships they are. I've got 4 different lists, which each have completely different sets of names. So either the ships are operating under more than one name, which is not unusual. Let's be honest. I am familiar with the Spanish Navy, where they have their blessed name and the name everyone actually uses when talking about them. And sometimes people use a shortened, abridged version of the blessed name, which creates a third variant of a name that you can be calling that ship in some books, because the historians involved like to try and cause the other historians who are reading their work to have absolute brain freezes because of the amount of names they're trying to juggle and figure out in their heads. But this is completely different sets of names. And this is speaking of someone who, to be fair, can to an extent read Cyrillic. And has tried reading some Cyrillic sources to try and figure this out. So honestly, I can tell you how many ships they have. I can tell you there are worked up fleets. I can tell you that with Ushakov, his tactics were used on very much organization, on closing to close quarters of any forces without evolution of a fighting order, concentrating firepower where possible on enemy flagships. What does this sound like? This sounds like the people who are actually successful at the Battle of Trafalgar against Nelson. He liked to maintain a reserve in his fight that he could call in. He liked to have aimed artillery fire maneuvering when he was dealing with land battles. And he believed in chasing the enemy to its destruction or capture whenever he could within the framework of the defined success missions of the success points of the mission. He insisted on sea and fire training for his staff and would not tolerate officers who couldn't do the job, couldn't go up the mast and couldn't do the jobs with their sailors. He didn't believe in it. In fact, he was massively interlinked with Suvorov's principles of training for sailors and officers, and really did push them. He was obsessed with training. So his fleet was really well worked up. He wanted to have a very, very competent, very capable fleet. And it's kind of appropriate that, well, to this day, the Order of Ushakov, which was established in 1944, is bestowed to command grade naval officers for outstanding leadership in the Russian Navy. It had 2 classes established in World War II. But it's been put down since 2010. It's become just 1 class, and it's basically it's a medal and a ribbon. So if you ever see an officer, source add picture, image file, with this ribbon on them on the television, if they're Russian, that means they have, according to their commanders, have shown outstanding leadership. and are members of the Order of Ushakov. And it is kind of interesting if you go back and check which officers have achieved the highest ranks in the Russian Navy and even the Soviet Navy before that. Very rarely does anyone get into the higher echelons of admiral, let alone to heads of fleets, who don't have this pretty little ribbon sitting on them. So it's something to look out for. It's one of those things. I know I've talked about this before. There are certain things you can look out for in an officer's career that will tell you where they're heading. Getting that is one of those things which, if they're in the Russian Navy, tells you they're going quite high up. That squad. 6 ships of the line and 6 frigates. Called our fleet. Yeah, there was a limit to how much either side was prepared to send. But there again, when you combine it together, you have 12 ships of the line and 11 frigates combined in the combined fleet. And both sides then maintained a similar force back in the Black Sea, staring at each other, going, "We're allies! We're allies! We like each other! Yeah! Look at my big fleet! Yeah! Look at my big fleet! Aren't we being friendly?" There's a British ship usually sailing between them going, "Remember your allies, we own both of you." The frigate captain looking around himself going, "Yeah, if this actually turns into a firefight, I'm going to be matchsticks." So, Scott, you left out the best bit of that comment. I didn't. Didn't get it. Anyway, so the Russian fleet which goes is well organized, very proficient. And the Ottoman fleet that turns up seems to be fairly well led as well, and is very proficient. Both sides seem to have sent some of their better admirals. But why did the British were sort of intervening and trying to keep the Ottomans and Russians okay with each other? But there's a limit to even the Brits' power and the Brits' willingness to put up with them. Honestly, the Brits were sitting there going, "We're nursemaiding both sets of egos" at one point. There's honestly a how do I put this? There is a letter from a captain to Nelson, which I've only seen excerpts of because they're in a book. I haven't seen the letter. And you can read it of one of two ways. He's either very politely saying that Nelson needs to come over and actually knock some heads together, or alternatively suggesting that everything is going fine despite the problems. Now, the author who wrote the book is not British, they're American. And they've taken it as the latter. Possibly because of my long history of being so sarcastic myself, am looking at it and wondering if it's actually more the former. Ned Kamen, joke conversation we had on Draxer and Discord involved listing all the other sailors. Allied ships were on the list. So, the Ottoman fleet. Well, according to the Russians sources, and most of the sources when you try and look it up, it's commanded by Vice Admiral Kadir Bey. If you look at the link below, which, by the way, if anyone wants to update Wikipedia to actually put his freaking name in, you'd be more than welcome. It's commanded by Capitan Abdul Kadir. Now, I'm fairly certain that the Ottoman sources are correct on this one, but again, I'm not updating Wikipedia myself because at that point it starts to get quite disturbing if I start updating Wikipedia. Now, I have to admit, there is a sort of difference in how they approach each other. When they first meet, this is what Ushkov writes back. His first impressions of his Turkish counterpart in his dispatch to the Russian envoy in Istanbul, Vasily Tomarov. I have become well acquainted with the commander of the Turkish squadron, Pasha or Vice Admiral Kadir Bey. He seems to be extremely gentle and a courteous man, and everything was decided by us in a friendly way. On this occasion, taking into account his politeness and general agreement in decisions, I would like to express to Your Excellency my appreciation of Kadir Bey. I ask you to communicate my appreciation to the Sublime Porte. Judging by the beginning, I hope that, if it continues this way, we shall be fully satisfied by each other and expectantly achieve good accomplishments. The Ottoman fleet is interesting. Our main sources, thanks in part to some of the history around it, but also some of the issues around it in terms of what has been said. What has been said about it. What is plainly. Our trouble for the Ottoman fleet and our study of it is really not enough sources materials survive in Turkish archives about the Ottoman Navy. They really don't. Not enough sources. Not as I understand it. I could be wrong because I'm limited in terms of I mainly can perceive it through the linguistics of the literature which I can read, which is English, to an extent German, French, and Russian. Extent reading. We've been over my pronunciations and my actual speaking ability. And engineering, of course, is another language I can read and speak actually quite fluently when I need to. But one of the things that has really been driven home to me recently, looking at some of the sources, and especially some of the open source documents and works about this, is that there isn't enough done. There isn't enough available to really discuss the Ottoman fleet in detail. But we can talk about this task force because, Bay equals Beg. Bay is the older transcription. I do know, but I sometimes change that just because I can. There is something interesting, though, about Abdul Kadir there. For instance, Ushkov occasionally has to ask him certain things, like this. I repeatedly asked Your Excellency, and in turn was reassured, that you had requested troops for the siege of Corfu from the Pashas on the Romanian side. You possess the decree from the Sultan Blind Port that states from whom to demand troops for this purpose. That is why I'm asking Your Excellency repeatedly, in written form, to call troops immediately from the Pashas, in accordance with the Firman. In absence of these troops, a long period of time was wasted in vain. Meanwhile, I am repeating my request to do your best to make sure that troops will be sent immediately with all the necessary provisions, ammunition, bullets, and gunpowder. Gunpowder could be supplied from squadrons if necessary, but it is impossible to get rifle bullets here. When you have fulfilled my appeal, please keep me informed. However, there were a lot of problems. The Russians found that the Ottomans were, and again, we talk about the Ottoman fall, and there's sort of people go sick man of Europe and all these things. Well, here's a clue of what sort of issues you have in the Ottoman Empire, even back in the 1790s. There was a postscript to a letter to Ali Pasha, and they kept talking to each other as well as writing letters to each other. This was a very integrated command in that approach. Your people were present here during the French attack from the fortress of our battery. Both Kadir Bey and I ordered them to assist our troops, but their commander disobeyed us and did not go. This happened before noon, and later we sent him dispatches thrice, but he disobeyed and did not go. I have ordered your physician, who was present here, to report this event to you, and ask for the punishment of this man in accordance with the law in order to stimulate others to obey. If your men do not obey on such grave occasions, they will cause us damage rather than profit. Mainly, they had trouble with the guy who ruled Greece for the Ottoman Empire because, well, Pasha Ali was, how do I put this politely, on the take and always after his own stuff. Although even he had trouble, he didn't really want to cross Abdul Qadir Bey because he seems to have had far better links with the Ottoman Porte. Never mind, that's Clarke. Engineering language? I guess I'm going to need English to engineering translate books now. To be fair, the reason I consider engineering a language, and this is going to sound strange, is the moment I start explaining engineering and talking through engineering with non-engineers, and people who are, in my case, I've always grown up and I've always had, my family's always been engineering heavy. So I've had to speak engineering my whole life to understand my family, basically. But there is a syntax and a way of speaking when you're an engineer. There's a way of thinking when you're an engineer. And it leads to a linguistic selection and leads to a phraseology choice and it leads to a way of laying stuff out. And people who don't have that background can find that quite confusing. I know, because this is going to sound terrible, but one of the roles I most often did and have done since I've got my PhD and even before that was colleagues would send me engineering documents which they're looking at during their research and go, can you explain this for me, please? And basically, I am translating engineering. And also there is the fact that, to an extent, engineering is a bit of a universal language. If you can get an engineering report written in almost any language, and if you understand engineering, you can figure out what it's saying. Because you can work out where the formula, you can see the points, and you can extrapolate from there. You might not be able to understand the analysis, but you can work out what they're doing, their methodology, and the details. I didn't think you could keep a straight face while saying that, while writing that. That's good. Anyway, the combined fleets, 12 ships of the line, 11 frigates, many, many smaller vessels, including a few which were probably being called galleys in earlier ages, but at this point were just called large rowing vessels. And roughly 6,000 troops. Roughly 2,000, roughly 4,000 Russians, and 4,000 Ottomans. For example, when dealing with Ali Pasha, who was, of course, the gentleman who I mentioned earlier, regarding misconduct of his Arabian troops. Your people here present here during the French attack from the fortress on a battery. Yeah, I've just mentioned that one. That was to them. Yes, another one as well. Oh no. Sorry, this is the thing is I have all sorts of ones copied, but I don't want to read out too many. But I did go through and tick the ones which might be good to read to you all. In this, it really is an excellent. As I said, there is a link down below. You can follow the link and download this document. And if you're interested in finding out about it, it is very worthwhile finding it. Here's an interesting thing from Allied operations perspective. In the two letters of Your Excellency, it is mentioned that the Ministry is concerned about the maintenance of good relations between myself and Kadir Bey. However, I remember such an occurrence, as described in Tomara's letters, of Kadir Bey visiting me 10 times and I returning only one visit. Kadir Bey would visit me perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row, but at all times I visit him more than he visits me, or all our visits are related to business. If one of us has the need and an opportunity to come, he comes and is always welcomed. Just before I received your letter, I indeed visited him about 10 times in a row, and then I told him in a jest that what was written to me. He answered that he was not aware of it, and never made such calculations since both of us were exchanging visits in accordance with current necessities, and that therefore this accusation was unjustified. As for the alleged story that my servicemen punched Galingis, and I didn't punish the attackers, it never happened. I told this alleged story to Kadir Bey, and asked if anything had taken place, but he replied that he was unaware of it. If something really takes place, it is always instigated by the Turks, but I disregard everything in order to stay friendly. Ali Pasha was a consistent problem, but we'll leave that to one side. And honestly, I have probably given you now enough background about the command structure and what was going on. But, yeah. There were problems in various points with it. It's worthwhile reading the whole thing. And if I can do more about the Russian admirals, I will at a certain point, because I think some of them are good, but I need to get... It's kind of like... Let's see. This book, which I've got, which about the Japanese admirals. I need to find an equivalent on the Russian admirals from that period. But no, it's a fairly decent force, and it's a fairly well-equipped force. I think so. Only the kind of French force was facing 2 fleets at once. Inadequate French forces facing worse than two fleets of one. They were facing a combined fleet led by two fairly confident admirals. That's just problematic for anyone to deal with. Okay, let's see. Louis-Francois Jean Chabot. That's going to be 43. So that one is 50. Now, Louis-Francois Jean Chabot is, how do I put this politely? An interesting soul. He really is. He is the person sent to take over, in many ways, the rule of the Ionian Islands, and he's one of the people I feel pretty sorry for in a way. He managed to survive 1757 to 1837, so he does pretty well. But I think that's mostly because nobody really sweats him. I.e., he's a perfectly competent administrator. No one's going to be too upset with anything he does. But also, and I say this with much love, no one's too worried about him taking their jobs. He's in charge of the siege. And let's be honest, his strength, theoretically, his strength is 3,500 troops, two ships of the line, and a frigate. That's his theoretical strength. And of those, he will get 2,900 captured, a ship of the line captured, and a frigate captured. I don't know. Theoretically, he does supposed to have more troops. But the problem is, and I say this in the nicest way for him, he has most of his soldiers and guns in Corfu. And the 500 soldiers and 5 batteries of artillery are on the island of Vido. The troops in Corfu are, to say they're not really the luminary soldiers of the French army, as being very encouraging. And to say that he is Ushkov is an understatement. Could he have won? That's an interesting question. Well, theoretically, he has a fairly decent position, which we'll be looking into in a bit later, but it gets problematic. It gets really problematic. The siege, when it initially begins, Ushakov turns up with just 3 ships of the line, 3 frigates, and some a number of small ships. Later, the other ships turn up. The rest of the Turkish ships turn up under, I said, Abdülkadir Bey. And thought more Russian ships turn up under Dmitry Senyavin, who is another officer who's going to go on to great standing in the Russian Navy. I would like to say more about Louis Francois Jean Chabot, but honestly, he's a grey person of history. He's a name. It's kind of like when you're looking at history, you're looking for the names of the people who St. Vincent beat. Or you're looking for the ones who Rodney beat. For Nelson, Villeneuve comes out, but that's about the only one. Well, yeah, pretty much. No one really sort of remembers many of the people he's beaten. Well, Chabot has the honor of being one of the people beaten by Ushkov, who mostly beats up the Ottomans, but occasionally does beat up the French. And a few others when he gets the chance. Basically, he's an equal opportunities beater-upper when he gets given the option. So the only thing worse than one fleet led by two competent admirals is one fleet led by two admirals that are totally incompetent, but I think they're the best to ever live. So you cloned Beatty. Conscripts. Conscription isn't like it is today. Isn't viewed like it isn't the same as it is today. And sort of today, conscription is a dirty word almost, which is kind of strange when you think the armies that are so known for their great victories and their great prestige in the First World War and the Second World War were both conscript armies. But leaving that to one side, yeah. They are sort of impressed. So we have the ships he has. Well, he has the Genereux. The Genereux is an interesting vessel. For starters, it had been launched in Rochefort in 1785. It's a Temeraire class 74 ship gun of the line. It would serve in the Royal Navy, where it was inquired by the Royal Navy in 1800. I do love the way Wikipedia phrases that. It was acquired by the Royal Navy in 1800. Yes, it was acquired. It was one of the ships that managed to escape the British at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. And it, after the Battle of the Nile, managed to take HMS Leander, a 50-gun ship. In March 1799, she had escorted a convoy to Corfu. Along en route, her captain decided to bombard Brinzi and was actually killed in the ensuing exchange with Brinzi. So his senior lieutenant, Claude Tuffet, took over. In February 1800, well, she'd be under Captain Renaudon, and it'd be during his time in charge, and leading a squadron comprising of the frigate Badin, the corvette San Peril and the Fauvette, and the Flute, Ville de Marseille, under Rear Admiral Jean Baptiste, that, well, she ended up taking part in the Battle of Malta Convoy, which Perret, the Rear Admiral in charge, was killed. Genereux covered the squadron, allowing the rest to escape before she herself was captured. And the battle ensign that she was flying in that fight was actually given to the city of Norwich by Berry and Nelson, and the flag is still preserved. It's a special artifact of the period, and I think it's still in the Norfolk, Norwich area, as I understand it, still preserved. She was broken up in 1816. Anyway, she'll escape. This is the only pictures I can find of Leander are rather like this picture, which shows Leander here. This one, which shows the battle where Leander's being taken. HMS Leander is the first ship with the name Leander, I think, in service of the Royal Navy. Yes, she is the first one. The beginning of the Greek Age and the Royal Navy's naming. She is quite a successful service of the Royal Navy until she's captured in 1798 by the French. And of course, she'll be recaptured in 1799 by the Russians, who return her to the Royal Navy and go, "Look, we got your ship back for you." The Royal Navy go, "Thank you." You know, these things happen. Ships go around, come around. So, along with these two ships of the line, there's also another smaller vessel, a sort of 20-gun ship, which is in the force. So he's got a third-rate 74-gun, and he's got Leander, which is, well, she's a fourth-rate 50-gun vessel. I wouldn't say, though, the heaviest 50-gun first-rate vessel, because she's got 24-pounder and 12-pounder guns in roughly equal distribution. So there are fourth-rates which carry a lot more weight of shot. She's basically a heavy frigate. They have the old fortress. And this is one of the problems with Corfu, is that really it has a lovely, thanks to the Venetians, who had, of course, defended Corfu quite heavily because it's been a key part of their empire. It has an abundance of fortifications that need to be defended. Ouch. The old fortress is pretty darn cool. It's one of those scenarios where you're looking at it and going, well, that's cool. It had been built originally in the medieval period. They started constructing it in 1545. It withstood sieges in 1537, 1571, and 1716. The great sieges of Corfu by the Ottomans. It will actually goes on to end up being occupied by the Nazis during World War II. Always nice of them. And it is literally stood the testimony of time. It is one of those buildings which is massive in every stretch of the imagination. if you go to Corfu and you don't manage to go visit this, you are missing out on a absolutely glorious piece of medieval architecture and construction, and it's well worth seeing. They have pretty much fortified a mountain, is how I describe it. There is sort of the similar fortifications I can think of are in Jersey and a few other places like that, but it's really something special to go and have a look at. Has everyone ever been forced to be an admiral? There were a few Royal Navy admirals who were hoping to retire who didn't get a choice. There's poor Somerville, who was basically on the sick list, dragged back from being sick to assist with Dunkirk, does a good job, gets Force H, is still not well, gets sent out to command the Eastern Fleet, then gets sent out to America. It's just non-stop a case of, yeah, off you go, off you go. It's not so much. It's not like impressing an admiral. You don't. But they can be. Occasionally, they have been known to be emotionally blackmailed into doing the job. But my Lord Admiral, no one is as good as you. Oh, great. We've appointed your son to command one of the ships in the fleet. And by the way, we have this admiral who's a complete idiot, who, if you don't say yes, is going to be put in charge of that fleet. Oh, great. The British have done that a few times. The Russians have done it at least twice. The French have done it a couple of times. Yeah, it's an old way of doing it. Not so much you want someone who's going. You don't impress them in the case of force them because then they might betray you. You have a way of making. Of course, the trouble is if their son then gets killed anyway in the fleet actions, they hold you responsible, and then you can be in all sorts of trouble. But you know, deal that when it comes to it. Mm-hmm. Oh. So that's the old fortress. That's one of the defensive points. And here's the new fortress. Which is, I don't really know how to describe the new fortress in adequate terms for it, but honestly, someone decided they wanted to construct something massive. And when they say new fortress, it's called the new fortress. It was built between somewhere between 1572 to 1728. So the old fortress is constructed between 1545 and 1555. And that's called the old fortress, and that's still in use at this point. And the new fortress, well, there's diagram up in the corner, is from 1688. So, in the nicest way, calling it a new fortress in 1798 seems to be a bit of a stretch. Especially as there's the Fortrezza Nova di Corfu. It's 200 years old! Well, no. By the time this map is, it's still 100 years old. Can we all agree something is not new when it's 100 years old? I know I'm shouting at this point. I know there are people who like to complain about me shouting. But seriously, when something reaches 100 years old, can we all agree it is no longer new? I don't care if it's the younger fortress by 20-odd years than the other fortress. It is not new. By the way, the other stuff is some other things additioned on. The red and the green lines are things which are added on later. The Chaponnos Bastion was added on in 1728. That's the green line. And there's a fort added on in red. It's just a massive slab of stone. It's incredibly impressive. I'd love to actually get to wander around it at some point in my, as a tourist. Governors of the old and new, under the Venetian system, the governors of the old and new fortresses were elected by the Venetian Senate and would serve the post for 2 years. They would be sworn before the Senate, and part of their oath was to never communicate with each other during their 2-year tenure as governors of fortress. So basically, under the Venetian rule, you would have these 2 fortresses next to each other. They were under their oath was to never communicate with each other for 2 years whilst they were on post. So basically, if you have someone who really annoys you, you and he want to both become captains of these forts at the same time, then you don't have to listen to it for 2 whole years. The idea, of course, was to stop them actually persuading each other to treason, but not really sure if it's the most sensible thing to do in the world. But they did used to have a commander above them as well, so, hey-ho. So, here is Corfu as it's lined out. We have the old fortress, we have the new fortress, we have the massive fortifications of Corfu. This is what you're looking at in 1798. Yep. It's massive. And yes, it is possibly, arguably, a little bit OTT. But remember, most of these fortifications weren't built by the French. They were built by the Venetians, trying to defend their territory at the maximum they could. They wanted to be able to hold these areas with a minimal garrison for maximum effect against the repeated Ottoman sieges. Remember, as I tried to say earlier, the Venetians had been attacked and laid siege to repeatedly by the Ottomans. Their whole control of the islands had been dependent on them being able to resist the sieges longer than the Ottomans could supply their troops in the field. After the first Great Ottoman Siege in 1537, that's when the new fort is built. That's when a lot of these fortifications are constructed. To build on most of this fortification network, the Venetians raised somewhere in the region of 2,000 homes. So the new fort is built on the hill of St. Mark, and there's the sort of the old fort is the one that is sort of up here. New forts there, and it's a massive creation. It really is. It's also quite disturbing in some respects. We'll leave that to one side. So again, you've got 3,000 troops. That's wonderful, but look at how big a space you have got to defend with 3,000 not very good troops. Yes, you've got 600 cannon. That's wonderful, but that's a lot of space to cover with those cannon. That's good. What about a mountain or volcano? That's been near 100 years old. When we're talking about castles, we're talking about castles. Mountains? If there's a new mountain which is only 100 years old, if there's a mountain which is only 100 years old, then that's probably some sort of trick of geography. As for volcanoes, well, yes, they can be new, but at 100 years old, do we really call it new? They're new relative to the other ones, but again. Mm-hmm. How Admiral Somerville managed to do all that with suspected tuberculosis is baffling. It frankly makes him even more amazing than many people consider. Seneca, why would you make a complete idiot admiral? Politics, usually. If you want to know where they end up, usually quite often they end up as the second in command of the fleet. Under the intelligent admiral. He spends his entire time basically thinking, if anything happens to me, he becomes in charge. This will motivate me to live forever. Remember, you can be a fairly efficient captain, and thanks to political connections, you can end up admiral in many navies in the world, including the British Navy. The fact is, though, not everyone transitions from being a captain to being a good admiral. It's a different skill set in many respects. A captain has to run a ship, an admiral has to run a fleet. A captain has to lead by example and will wander around the ship and will motivate the ship on an individual level. An admiral has to be able to let go and let his subordinates get on their post because he can't run around each ship. They can't run around each ship. Doctor, you don't think in geologic time. I think in terms of centuries. I'm a historian. But still, I think once something's reached over a century old, it's no longer a new. Hmm. That's right. Surely, if you're concerned about officers' loyalty, you maybe don't put him in charge of one of the most important forts in the empire, just in fort. That would be my idea, yes. But people can change. And the Venetians basically built their entire system on not trusting anyone. BCH, it was some 50 years later, but the Austrian attack on Venice by balloons launched from a ship could be cool to talk about sometime. It could be. William the Fourth syndrome. Anyway, has there been admirals that understood they were bad admirals and voluntarily get demoted to captain? No. That's the other thing you have to remember. Again, this is a problem, but it's a reality. It's, in the nicest way, when you're making life or death decisions, and it's something which I often find, especially with Star Trek and some of the others, although Cisco and Janeway were correct in many ways about this. SG-1 certainly got this right. You have to have a certain level of ego in order to bet other people's lives. Jean-Luc Picard always seemed to not really. It didn't really seem to phase him to an extent as much. It did phase. At points he would sort of show phase, but other points he would sort of try and almost pretend like he didn't have an ego. And the thing is, you can't do that job without having a very healthy belief in your own abilities. And that belief is not far away from an ego, because you have to. Because you have to make a decision. To an extent of strength, you have to have belief in yourself and belief in your abilities to make that decision, and that is a form of ego. Okay, there is the ego of going, I'm the best, I'm the greatest. That's a overabundance of ego. And that's a different thing from what I'm talking about. But you need a certain level of ego. It's like when you're dealing with university lecturers. In the nicest way, the quiet, bashful ones don't tend to be able to control lecture theatre. The quiet, strong ones can usually control lecture theatre because whilst they are quiet in terms of their normal mannerisms, they are confident in their abilities and they will stare and hold the room to control. But usually when you're talking about the larger lecture theatres, it's going to be the loud ones who are quite confident in their own knowledge and skills who will hold the lecture room to account and keep that lecture theatre going. And so it's sort of when I find my colleagues when they say, oh, no, I don't have an ego. I go, well, mentally I think, no ego, probably not that good on lecture. Because you need something in you to be able to stand up and tell several hundred people in the room, be quiet, you have to listen to me for the next 2 hours. If you don't have an ego, you're never going to do it. And it's the same with being in charge of a ship or an important forces. If you don't have a healthy belief in your own self, you're never going to be able to make a decision. You're always going to be crippled by going, oh, should I do that or that? Should I do that or that? What should I do? What should I do? What should I do? What should I do? When that's not the way to survive. That's not the way for your ships to survive and your people to survive. You need to actually make a decision. Then here, how come we're extended shifts as punishment in the Royal Navy, like the 36-hour shift in the Hornblower Mutiny? Rare. It was a viable alternative to, and it was something which some captains would prefer to do rather than flogging, etc. And some captains were very proud they never had to flog crew. That you have to remember in the Navy, which is famous for the lash, etc. There were many captains who were very proud of the fact they never had to flog a single crewman. And there's Admiral Duncan, who, whilst he does hold a man over the side of his ship by his neck, one-handed, never has to really resort to capital punishment to get his. That was when the ship was considering taking part in the North Mutiny. Never has to resort to capital punishment to get his ship to do what he needs to do. So this fortress must be costing up a keep. They were. Knights Again. In Stargate SG-1, it was okay. What is an O'Neill going to do to get them out of this week's mess? Well, occasionally Carter helped, and Teal'c was always there as well. But yes, O'Neill was fairly good at going. Right then, just making a decision. That was O'Neill's job, and O'Neill knew it. O'Neill never thought himself and that was the other good thing about O'Neill. He never had to be the smartest person in the room. He never had to be the person in the room who knew it all. That wasn't his job, and he knew it. Where in fact, that was where he was a good commanding officer. He listened to the experts, and then he made a decision. And he didn't question the decision afterwards. He made the decision. When those experts or anyone else around the room was questioning whether they got it right or wrong, he was going, "No, we'll do this. We know what we're doing." Alpha male said no. And the reason I say I don't like the alpha, beta, all those sort of things of descriptions of personalities, and I really, in my experience, leadership is required. And leadership depends to an extent on ego and ability to make a decision. And that doesn't necessarily, all those things which get attached to those various things, they don't help that. They give people a cloud of extra stuff. Different people have different ways of how they approach making a decision, but they have to be able to make, once they make a decision, stick with it. Anyway, there is one small problem with Corfu. There is a very small problem with it. It's this island off the coast of Corfu. It's called Vido. And you might have heard me mention earlier that wonderful military genius, Louis Chabot, put 500 troops and 5 artillery batteries on the island. If you're looking at the island, you're probably going, Alex, that island doesn't look that fortified. Trust me, it didn't look that fortified then either. Now, why had the Venetians not fortified the island? I have honestly no idea. If I'd been going to stick a new fort in Corfu, I'd have probably actually fortified the island of Vido heavily and had it as my third fort. Because if you consider where it is, if you control Vido, you control access to Corfu. Because it's right off the coast. And that means if you control there, you can also control the area in between Vido and Corfu. But the Venetians hadn't. The Ottomans had never really attacked it. And a bit here and there, but never sort of really anything. And the French do not correct them. They have, as I said, got 5 batteries of artillery and 500 troops sitting there. So you're going to guess what I'm going to tell you happens. Squad, a military leader has to believe enough in their ability and plan to make it their spawn that's believe in the plan and charge a lot of people who would quite like to kill them. Yep. No, top. I'm looking at the new fort on Google Earth. It looks like it was built to protect the flank of the old fort, but has a blind spot from the south. Maybe the emplacements are just hard to see now. 20%. That's true for hell. Admiral Duncan was a distant relative of mine. I now think you must be very tall. I can't remember the last time. The last time the Royal Navy used capital punishment on a warship was probably Napoleonic Wars, probably, but they maybe a bit afterwards, but I doubt it. They were even when it was on the books as an option, they were never that keen on it. Unless you were an admiral. If you were an admiral, they're quite happy to shoot you, but anyone else, they usually tried to figure things out. And 4 at least once used his political authority to keep O'Neill in SG command. Yeah, well, you know that's helpful when the literal god of war turns up, or Asgardian command admiral turns up to say you should be left in charge. It does help. No, for proper leadership. No. What I meant by this is you have to be. I think you need to be strong. I think you need to be strong in yourself. That is what I would say, because I've seen a lot of people who are built who are absolutely not able to actually command anything, and I've seen lots of people who look like they are absolutely. So I usually use the phrase "strong in themselves," and I have to be. I tend to be quite careful in these things on this, because not through politics, but because it's more a case of I deal with a lot of men and women in command positions and various other things, and I tend to avoid phraseology, especially like the alpha male scenario, because I feel that whilst I understand where that comes from, I feel it does a bit of disservice. But also, there's the alpha scenario tends to come with a level of view of dominance as a way of leadership. And I prefer a scenario, and I've seen it be far more successful, where you use, rather than dominance, respect. And I think respect tends to be a far better and far more thing for leadership, a far more productive form of leadership. And I would say when I look at Ushakov, he is very good at respect. There's a good example, if I use it, and I suppose I will get into Corfu and the actual siege, but I will use this to explain this one. Mm-hmm. Sorry about this. But if I'm going to if I'm getting into leadership, I'm going to use this quote. Mm-hmm. Sorry. Here's an example. Ushakov didn't hesitate to send samples of bad biscuits, inedible beans, etched to Tomara, and the Russian envoy presented them to Grand Vizier during a special conference held in Istanbul. During the meeting, the Russian ambassador broached a curious debate on the standards of Ottoman hardtack, which sheds light on the petty diplomacy that has often been neglected, as the history of diplomacy usually concerns itself with rivalries and matters of great magnitude. The Russian ambassador suggested that the Ottomans should use 3.5 kilo of wheat for baking at Kantar of hardtack, and buy a kilo of wheat at the price of 4 kuris on the market. The Ottomans adamantly objected on the basis of the Ottoman regulations concerning the hardtack, which specified the amount of wheat ingredient to be used for baking hardtack as 2.5 kilo. The Ottomans did not fail to stress that 2 kilo of wheat was left over after baking according to their own recipe. But no, basically, at one point, a whole lot of money is sent out to Pushkar as a thank you for doing his job, and he shares it with his sailors in his fleet and the sailors in the Ottoman fleet, so that it's shared amongst the two fleets equally because they've been doing the job equally. And it's very much a leadership by respect, and it works very well. And if you go through the history, if I motivate you by dominating you, you will only do so much. If I respect you, and I treat you with respect, but by that means I demand respect back for me. So if you don't give me respect, then I deal with you. But if you respect me and I respect you, and we have a respectful relationship, often you will do a lot more for me if I'm in charge than you would do for someone who's just dominating you to be there. And that is where my whole problem with the sort of the alpha, beta, all those things come from, because usually these days the whole theory has become about dominance. It's kind of like a few other theories, which they started out with very good ideas back at the beginning, but now the modern interpretations are very much about dominance. And that's not the way to lead. Confident, strong individual? Yeah. I'll take that. As I said, I don't... those whole things, going for grief letters and all those things, I avoid that completely. And I prefer to teach leadership. And you need leadership at all levels, because if you think about it, in a good command structure, you'll have personnel who can lead up as well as lead down. So they can anticipate what their commanders will need and can make sure they're providing it for, they've got it ready for them. So you have leadership going in both directions. And that's a respect command structure. Yeah. I thought that from having a conversation with you, I didn't think that was your interpretation of it, but that's why I'm not going down that phraseology, because of what others have now put on it. In the nicest way, the amount of times I have met people who describe themselves as, oh, I'm a real alpha, and actually they're a freaking bully. And usually, this is going to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but in about 2 seconds flat, I can get them to back down. Because they are not able to do the whole respect leadership thing, and they can't take someone who can just go, yeah, and what are you going to do about it? That's ignorant. Let me guess. The Italians overtook the fortress with the naval warships. Well, here is what happened. So come over. Revido, as well, I guess I would say no fault because of lack of sweet water. To an extent, that was definitely some of their reading, their idea behind it, but in the nicest way, you could figure things out. Because this is what happens. The Siege of Corfu. On the 4th of November, 1798, Ushkov's squadron turns up, as said, and initially it's 3 ships of the line. Eventually, the full fleet turns up. And on the first day, the French abandoned the fortifications on Lazaretto Island, which the Russians immediately reoccupied. Now, on the 13th, the Russians land and, without opposition, take the port of Guvia, which is about 5 miles along the coast. At this point, the Russians start building batteries ashore and shelling the French-held forts. In December, another Russian squadron, this one under Rear Admiral Pavel Pushkin, came to augment the besieging forces. It's at this point that the Russian fleet consists of the combined Allied fleet consists of 12 ships of the line, 11 frigates, and many small vessels. And some of the ships have had to rotate home. So there has been roughly 12 ships there for most of the time, but some of the ships have rotated home for maintenance. January, 26th of January, 1799, the General paints his sails black and, with the brig, escapes from harbour to sail to Ansonia. in Italy. So they managed to get through. Leander can't go. She's not in condition to. In February, 4,000 Ottoman troops arrive. Now, in February, also along with those 4,000 Ottoman troops coming, right, a Royal Navy Captain Stuart turns up, who immediately goes and does some charting of the waters. Hello. Yeah. You guys have been doing this so long? Yeah. How long exactly have you been here? Anyway, on the 28th of February, 1799, in the morning, the assault begins. There's a 4-hour bombardment of Vido by several of the ships. Eventually, all 5 shore batteries of the island have been suppressed. The Leander and Brun tried to intervene. The Brun was the frigate, 20-gun corvette frigate, which they had there. But they were damaged and forced to retreat to protection of the batteries of Corfu. 2,000 troops are landed on Vido, and after 2 hours of fighting, the island was taken. Now, by this point in the battle, the garrison had actually been reinforced up to 800 troops of Vido from the French. 200 of these were killed, 400 were taken prisoner, including the commandant of the island, Brigadier General Pivron, and 150 men swam to Corfu. The Russians lost 31 killed and 100 wounded. The Ottomans lost 180 killed and wounded. After Vido fell, well, on March the 1st, the captured batteries on the island opened fire on the city's forts. They'd been reinforced by guns taken from the ships as well. The Allied forces then followed this by storming and capturing the outlying forts of San Rocco, San Salvatore, and San Abraham. On the 2nd of March, Ushkov planned to assault the main forts, but before they could, the lovely Louis Chabot decided that, frankly, it was getting very scary here, and so he sent envoys to request a 48-hour armistice, and on the 3rd of March, they surrendered. And then the Russians promptly returned the Leander to the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy went, thank you. It was an honourable capitulation agreed. French troops were to be conveyed to Toulon, and the remaining French ships in the harbour were taken by the Allies. Said. Ushkov is honoured with the Order of the Star, Order of St. Alexander Nevsky, and given the Shagmalek by the Ottoman Sultan, which was an award which is rarely awarded to non-Muslims and certainly even more rarely awarded to an admiral who beat up so many Ottomans. So, it's ended. What happens? Well, this is where it gets interesting. This is where it gets really interesting. Because honestly, it's almost more interesting what happens now in the history of the Ionian Islands than what had happened before while the French had been in charge. Because it starts off with they set up the Septinsular Republic, or the Seven Islands Republic, which is technically an Ottoman/Russian protectorate, which the Russian fleet will base itself out of for many years in the Mediterranean. it was a compromise because neither the Ottomans nor Russia wished the other to have total control of the islands. The Russians wanted a base in the Mediterranean, which would give them access to the centre and perhaps the Western Mediterranean, without them having to go back into the Black Sea, because that route was, of course, controlled by the Ottomans. The Ottomans were worried about the Russians having a strong base this side of Greece when Ali Pasha was doing such a bang-up job running Greece that they were constantly having to deal with problems in Greece. And this was a state of affairs which theoretically could have continued for a while, but didn't really go on that long and well because, of course, in 1806, the Russians and Ottomans go to war with each other. And it then becomes a bit of a mess, and the British step in, as the British are wont to do. Because the British are watching these islands and going, oh, good Lord, the French will come back. The French will come back, or they're going to turn into a war zone. And they're quite useful islands, and we don't want them to turn into a war zone. So eventually, in 1815, under the Peace of Paris, officially it becomes recognised as a British protectorate. And they change from that symbol, which has come from the Venetian symbol. If you've ever seen a Venetian flag, it's basically the lion on a red background. This was the lion on a blue background. The lion, the British flag, let's be honest, how many flags in the world were once based on this sort of idea? And then becomes a British protectorate. Now, at this point, the British really have an interesting time. They do have to put down a couple of rebellions at certain points, mainly because, not because they actually want to control the islands, but because if the islands go independent, then they're going to cause even more trouble the Ottomans next door. It's kind of delicate balance what's going on in Greece. And they're always worried about Greece. And eventually the Ottomans pull out of Greece, and they go, admittedly, there is King George I of Greece installed, and the Greeks are very happy. We have our own wonderful state, and the British basically go, here, have the Ionian Islands as a thing to show your legitimacy and power in the eyes of the people. Which was a great idea, but it also got rid of the Ionian Islands for the British, which was quite useful because they were full of a hotbed of various political radicalisms, which then caused the king trouble in Greece. Because the trouble is, it goes back to the democratic ideas which had started off with the first French occupation, in that the French had gone, we'll bring you democracy. And of course, that democracy wasn't a real democracy, but that had sparked the idea, the revolutionary, the drive, the zeal for this democracy in the Ionian Islands. And it meant that the King of Greece basically got these islands, which was lovely because they are part of the Greece heritage and they're Greek islands. Yes, they're Greek. But he also gets with them a whole load of politicians who are complicated, and he has to manage, and who don't want to listen to him or anyone. And you start to feel kind of sorry for the Greek king at this point. At least I do. If you need to tell people that you are an alpha, then you are not an alpha almost by definition. True. I think wasn't that a little embarrassing? It might have been for them. To be fair, in nicest way, if you walk into a room as a lecturer and a student tries to tell you they're in charge of the room, not you, it's going to be embarrassing for them quite quickly, or you're going to have to end up leaving the room. Admittedly, though, I did once tell a lecturer who was in charge of me, and this is actually why I said to Professor Glenn Richardson in my first lecture with him, because I was having an argument. We were having an argument over ship construction, ship crewing in the Elizabethan Navy, and he said, "I'm the." He basically was going, "We need to finish this so we can have a lecture." And I came out the words, I bow to your superior title then. And he sent me back a message when I got my PhD. He sent me a message saying, because he's a professor, he said, I still have a superior title, but I doubt you'll be bowing anytime soon. Used to love having arguments with him. That was some great lunches sometimes. Oh. That's good. Did the French get to march out under their colours? Yes, to an extent. They got to go home, and they got conducted to a safe passage to Toulon, escorted by a Russian ship of the line. That's it. Unintended consequences of that block. They are fun. No, but Terry Pratchett always has a good line in that. As the Sergeant Major in Monstrous Regiment, if you've ever read that book by Terry Pratchett. And not quite said the whole way through, but if you read it, you can work out that they are very correct when they say their words. They are not a violent man. It's a good book to read. Consequences of the siege of Corfu? Well, to be fair, in 1953, Mikhail Rom made his scenographic dramatization of the islands on the second cornerstone of his second of his two-part epic about Amurushkov. It was released. Its title, basically in English, translates as "The Ship Stormed the Bastions" or "Attack from the Sea," and released by Mosfilm. I can honestly say, having watched the movie with the dubbing in English, I'm not sure how well it honestly was dubbed in English, and watched it with subtitles in English, which was actually slightly better. It's definitely no Hornblower, but it's watchable, but it's no Hornblower. But it's something to realize there are more movies about Ushakov than there are about Nelson. Which perhaps shows you the movie-making sensibilities of the two countries. Or maybe the obsession with the Russians of finding heroes back in the Imperial Age who they could actually look up to in they're under the rule of communism. You'll get there, Strider. You'll get there. They're worth reading through. The islands are kept by the British to basically make sure they go to the Greeks and make sure they don't go to the French. It's the classic thing is the British are keeping the islands not because they want them. They have Malta. They have all sorts of other islands. They don't want the French to get them. That's literally their entire reason for holding onto these islands is to stop the French getting them. Because they don't trust the Ottomans to control. And they really don't trust Ali Pasha. They do not. He's one of those figures from history who just everyone's sort of looking at going, how? The Greeks were very pleased to get the Ionian Islands back. It was considered part of their heritage in the country. It wasn't the Greeks who were upset about getting islands back, it was the king who was upset about getting the islands back because he inherited a load of politicians who were quite difficult to deal with. It's one of those things. The various politicians that they try that sort of take it over and try and sort of run it are pretty darn special. And when I say special, I mean really kind of special. There are some very good politicians, and there are some very interesting politicians. But under the British, they become called the United States of the Ionian Islands. I love that. The British set it up and call it. It's 1815, so this is long after the American War of Independence, which was won the United States. And the Americans call it theirs the United States of America, British call it the Ionian Islands. Go. So we're setting a protectorate in the Mediterranean. What should we call it? Well, we don't want to call it the Seven Islands Republic or anything like that. So let's call it the United States of the Ionian Islands. Okay, am I or am I not thinking that's a subtle trolling of America going on there? Just a little one. United States of the Ionian Islands. Come on, there's just a little bit of trolling going on there. Just a little bit of trolling. To an extent, Ali Pasha was very, very high place. I wouldn't say necessarily. You see, there's a trouble. Idiots don't tend to get far. But there are people who have just enough levels of smarts, they get quite far, but they then believe themselves far smarter than they are. And they try to exceed their abilities. Pasha is one of those. He has, yes, got a certain level of ability and capability. He is certainly not stupid. But he's not as smart as he thinks he is. Vintage history. Aren't all politicians still do? Not really. I have met some decent ones in my time. Most of them are those ones are retired, but I have met some decent ones. Nice. So what's the March patron choices? Well, the selection's up at the moment as we speak. So basically, I'm letting people suggest stuff, and then their vote will be on starting next week at some point. And the vote's going to be. I will announce what the patron choices are going to be on, not Sunday, but Sunday the 13th, probably. Right, how do you figure out which one of those one's self is? I'd like to know, Doc. My own view is that you are only really start to fail when you start to believe you will succeed without questioning it. Again, go back to leadership. And I use O'Neill as a good example, because O'Neill, for SG-1, yes, he's a mythical character, but the good thing about talking about fictional characters is I can talk about them without people getting incredibly upset about what I'm about to say. He's not the smartest cookie. He is not the smartest member of his team. He's not stupid, but he's not the smartest member of his team. He doesn't need to be. He's prepared to listen to people. He's prepared to listen to their views, and he then makes a decision. He works out who the smartest is. Basically, the moment you realize you're really dumb is when you stop listening to other people. When you start being able to think, you stop thinking there's anyone smarter than you in the room, and therefore you only take notice of what you yourself think. That's when you've reached a level at which you are no longer really you have exceeded your ability. As long as you're prepared to listen to experts, don't necessarily always do exactly what the experts say, because experts are not. Just because you have expertise doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be infallible, because the expertise usually means you have a lot of knowledge in a very specific area. And the point about being a leader is you have to take in the expertise from lots of areas so you can put them all together and synthesize it. And that's your role. And to an extent, the role of your staff, which should be assisting you in doing that. And let's put it this way. I always consider there's a big problem in staff work when you have documents being produced which are flooded with, how do I put this, acronyms and specialist wordage. If you cannot explain what you are saying in plain language, you don't understand it. First rule of being able to understanding a topic: can you explain it in a way in which the general public can understand it? If you can't, then you aren't an expert. You need to go study it more. And if you're a staff officer writing a report and you can't do that, then you haven't studied enough to be writing that report, and you shouldn't be writing that report for your boss, because your boss is no help with understanding, because their whole purpose of having staff is because they've got to synthesize so much information that it's broken down into different roles to synthesize that area so they can then bring it together. This one, Ali Pasha got to the point where he thought he didn't have to hide anymore because he was too powerful to touch. If I remember correctly, his fate suggested otherwise. Yes. He has some skills, and it certainly does have some abilities, but he's been appointed. Ali Pasha is a good example, because he appointed the Pasha ruler of Ionia, which is basically most of modern-day Greece. And whilst he had interest in modern ideas and all sorts of things, and he was, to an extent, very much about securing his own power and position, and very happy to do so. He was very vengeful and harsh in opposing law and order, according to some, but I would say probably on that one, he was probably trying to be zealous enough to actually hold it in at the beginning, and by the end, he just got into the habit, and he just became, every time if you escalate and continue to keep escalating level of violence, then you eventually become almost politely, a caricature of yourself. You've got to be more violent in order to live up to your reputation of being violent, so that people don't rebel against you because of the level of violence you'll bring. You kind of get trapped into a self-defeating circle. He opposes Ottoman military reforms in the 1820s, is eventually in the 1810s, is declared a rebel in the 1820 and killed in 1822 at age 81 to 82 after he'd been pretty much destroyed. He conducts a fair number of atrocities in his time, and he's basically is almost pushing to try and set up his own state, and he fails. Which again, it's success of the Ottoman Empire or the Ottomans that they managed to suppress the most powerful Ali Pasha, but it kind of shows the weakness also within the Ottoman Empire that such a person had managed to develop and not being carefully massaged out of post. Seneca Nero, with my first proper paycheck, I will go on Fiverr and commission art, HMS Unicorn in a My Little Pony painting. That sounds cool. My sister would love that. Vigorous Genghis Khan hoarded, for lack of a better term, all the smartest and highly skilled specialists in all fields into his personal sphere. Yeah. One of the things Genghis Khan was quite successful at, collecting wives, mistresses, well, harem members, and experts, scientists, engineers, anyone who was smart and good at their roles, he would try and attract to his court. O'Neill, two L's. There is another one. There's no one single L. No sense of humor. Not an idiot. He plays one when convenient to be underestimated. He can fly military jets. You need plenty of intelligence. Yeah. What I mean is, in the room, he knows he's not as smart as Carter. He doesn't claim to be as smart as Daniel or Carter, but he doesn't need to be, and that's the thing. That's the point I was making about O'Neill. VCH, vintage car history. Speaking of trolling the USA, police officers have to take an IQ test before taking the job. Right then. So, any questions? Because we've sort of got to. I was thinking this was going to be roughly 3 hours long, and I have to admit it is sort of getting to the point of finishing at 2 hours and 40 minutes. So, any questions? What have you thought about the siege of Corfu? I was hoping to, as I said, have some videos recorded by a friend to add into here, but yeah, they couldn't. So it's a cool scenario to look at because of the different allied operations involved and because of the complexities that come about it. But also there are some realities of Corfu. there is the fact that why is Corfu important? And it also goes back to this point, if I quickly skip through here. Strategically, this is one of the most important operations in the entire War of the Second Coalition. But it's the Russians and Ottomans, and the only way you can tell Corfu is part of this War of the Second Coalition is if you look very carefully, you can see Corfu is actually written on here. So, what other victims of warships of propaganda? Warships of victims of propaganda. There are lots of them. Basically, any time a warship is marketed to the public as the most powerful ship in the world, that's going to be a victim of propaganda because it won't be there for long. Dick Richards, is that like the siege of Snake Island? Not really. And the reason I'd say that is because, honestly, both sides are more balanced in the Corfu than at the Snake Island. Theoretically, there is a theoretical chance that Juve could win. But for him to actually win, he'd need to do some really good, interesting work. You know, Shepard is the Kirk of the Stargate franchise. Even Rodney said so. Vision O'Neill is an older James Kirk. No. In the nicest way, I won't hear O'Neill or Shepard denigrated in any way by suggesting that they are anything like James Kirk. Okay? I like Kirk, but in the nicest way, Kirk pretty much all the time flies by the seats of his pants. Shepard and O'Neill improvise, but they tend to follow some sort of planning procedure and organization, and they don't tend to be quite as obsessed, well, perhaps that's because of the influence of Carter, etc., with finding their latest female conquest on the interesting planet of the week. Did the Russians get paid for returning HMS Leander? No. They gave it as a gift to the British, which was very nice. Yeah, I would say SG-1 is it's more a scenario of TNG and DS9, and that things do come back to bite you from 2 seasons back sometimes. The VCH replace Kirk with Clarke. The 5-year mission would have been quite different. How? Oh, good lord. Probably a lot less side quests. Hopefully, I'd have been as good at surviving and making the decisions when they needed to be. Done. Probably had a lot more drilling and working out with my red shirts exactly how to fight in ground combat, because I would not like to keep sending letters home for the red shirts. Seriously, that would depress me, so I would be having those guys out training every freaking day. It would be non-stop combat drills, combat drills, combat drills, You will learn how to fight as fricking infantry so you do not get wiped out every time we have a bloody battle. Use the French there. Hello, Christopher Ryan. That's a Hood, Yamato, Bismarck are the three most well-known victims of propaganda. Yes, they're all the most recent ones. Vision, O'Neill is more jaded than Kirk. That's the 1L, O'Neill. Yeah. I tend to prefer to have a modicum of planning in my structures and operations. It tends to help us have a modicum of planning. And there's lots of love for Stargate Atlantis. Atlantis was always my favorite, but I can never understand why the Atlanteans had built this giant, great big city ship and not built on it the production facilities for at least the puddle jumpers. And honestly, the production facilities for their, or at least the methodologies of how to produce 0-point modules. Sorry, this is completely off topic for today, but you know, the Stargate Atlantis one, it always confused me how it was a case of, yes, this is the power source we need, and we haven't included in this. I realize they are portrayed as a really arrogant race, and they are. But the thing is, Atlantis had been presumably built earlier than they got massively arrogant. So you presume at some point they'd have built into it the facility needed to either create more 0-point modules, or the methodology of, this is how you go about creating one. Oh, and here is how you can build a puddle jumper, because you need those little ships. And that would have been quite useful, because imagine Atlantis if you can build your own puddle jumpers. Even if you could build something bigger than a puddle jumper. Or drones, and their actual weapon system. Yes, again, in a nice way, you have this giant city which happens to have this giant power supply, apparently. 0-point modules are supposed to be near the infinite power supply, and it has 3 of them. And you don't have the production facilities for producing your own weapons. And why do you have all your weapon systems based around one form of weapon? Why don't you have iron counter? I know the Stargate is conceived in a period when people were going, missiles will make it all, and we don't need guns anymore. But in the armed forces, and I realise that does affect it to an extent, that legacy in Hollywood. But seriously, no one heard of point defense cannon? Seriously, take out fighters and anything that actually comes close, so that the big systems can concentrate on dealing with things further away. Hey. Okay, generally battles are bloody though. Yes, they are, but they don't tend to wipe out your entire detachment of red shirts. There is no need for them to wipe out. Seriously, there are some of the episodes, they literally come charging across the hill, all in plain sight, bright red shirts gleaming. It's kind of like, oh good, we have cavalry from... Well, the Romans weren't that dumb, so I presume you must be from the British, the Civil War, the British Civil War. The War of the Four Kingdoms, because that's the only time I can think of cavalry being that stupid to come charging over a hill going, hello, we're here, we're brightly coloured. Even in the Napoleonic Wars, they didn't do that. Not unless there was a huge mass of them, and usually it's about half a dozen red shirts coming over the hill. In this case of, really? Chris Ryan, wouldn't that have been a database somewhere? You'd hope it would have been, but apparently they never found it. I think the idea was that much of the Lantine archive on Atlantis was damaged or inaccessible. There was so... Again, how's the... It's got a huge central database and apparently an interactive holodeck instructor sort of a system. Yes, I can understand inaccessible and all these things, but right, that's what we need to visit the Brits and vice versa. Puddle jumper. Oh, that'll be fun. I can't believe they forgot to add cannon to the Aurora class. Missile boat, really, later in the war. They added some cannons, 5-inch secondaries. Really. Am I right that in 1939 HMS Vanguard made sense, but there'd be little for her to do if she entered service with the Iron Fleet in 1944? No, she still would have been useful in 1944, and basically post-war she's useful for dealing with the Svuldov-class cruisers. That's basically her role, is, cruiser, deal with the Russians at certain points while they're building their big cruisers. Until you can get buccaneers and things in service which are supposed to deal with them from air, from my perspective. I thought there was just lots of it that had to be sorted through and translated, not that it was incomplete. I think that was the big thing. It was more translating it, but the nicest way, that would be the first thing I'd have gone in for translation. How do you build puddle jumpers? How do you build missiles? How do you build power systems? In reverse order. Power first, then the rest. I thought so, Jack Ray. Enterprise goes through red shirts like Voyager goes through shorts. Oh yeah, seriously, Voyager. What did they? The thing they never explained in Voyager, and this is what I thought they must have had. They must have had somewhere an industrial-sized, almost replicator system, which could be used to create shuttles. That was the only thing that could explain some of those shuttles reappearing. That's good. I see your argument and raise you to winged hussars of Vienna. They still attacked more en masse than 6 people. Sure, actually, what makes it worse is they at least had designs. There was an anti-orbit cannon on Arcturus. Yeah. They had all sorts of things, and they didn't use them. And the satellite cannon in the episode of Siege, yes, they had them. So they could have had put in some cannons. And imagine having some cannons in place. That would have been quite useful. Vision, the Star Trek project ship has an industrial replicator that can make a shuttle. Sounds good and sensible to me. Thank you, Stafford. Hello, Stafford. Hope you're well. Mm-hmm. CH, I trump you all with the Wicked Witch of the West Flying Monkeys, and if you listen closely, their chant is actually, "Oh, we love the old one." That scares me on some level. I'm glad that Colin Cameron that the Wi-Fi got set up and last and tested no problems. And we're not going to get into the topic of dragons, but, you know. Yes, the old one is Lucifer, by the way. Yes, I know. There are various names it goes by. I'd always be concerned about making a ship called HMS Captain. Have you looked up the history of that name in terms of what happens to the ships? But no. The whole point about the Siege of Corfu is it shows that even very bitter enemies can actually be allies at times and work together if you have good commanders. Vision. One episode of Star Trek had them go back in time and run into US Air Force security police. Best model, I think, for the Red Shirt Starfleet. Light Infantry Police Force. Actually, no, I will go one better. I think they go back in time and become the RAF Regiment. Because sometimes, and I love the RAF Regiment, but I can talk to them, and one day they will basically claim they are the equivalent of the Special Air Service. Next day, they'll claim they're equivalent of the Gurkhas and the Marines, or the Paras. And the next day, they'll talk about being specialist air defense specialists for airfields, etc. And they seem to always be taking on different roles. Whatever day, whatever discussion you're having, they're always able to do that role. And I feel the red shirts in Star Trek are sort of treated like that. Although, honestly, and this is going to sound terrible, I really loved the Archer series of Enterprise because they had the Makos on, who made sense. They actually had some proper troops on there to back up the Starfleet security personnel, who weren't really proper soldiers, let's be honest. They're Starfleet security for shipboard operations, but they're not really suited for land operations. And that made sense. I thought, woohoo, Marines. Makes sense. During DS9, when they're fighting all the ground battles, it would have been so sensible if they'd had some Marines. And you'd have thought, with all the things going on, the Federation, I can understand them not perhaps wanting them part of Starfleet. But having a Marine force, specialist infantry for those sort of operations, for planetary defense, and call them a planetary defense, call them the Starfleet, the Federation Planetary Defense Force or something like that, or the planetary, the Federation Ground Forces or something like that. But they should have had something. Disconnect them from the ships if you want. That's fine. Have them called the Federation Ground Forces. But they needed something, because they needed some troops. Because otherwise you're wasting people. You have trained to fly a ship and operate a ship, which is an expensive and difficult duty, to fight and do ground duties. And you saw the casualties they were taking in DS9. It's just absurd. You know, and again, Siege of Corfu. Oshkov could have used the sailors. He could have used the fleet sailors. No, but he insisted, let's bring some soldiers in for this. I'm not wasting my highly trained sailors to go and fight these land battles if I don't have to. Because they're trained to be sailors, and that's an expensive skill I need them for. And that's in the Age of Sail. Because the moral, allies and partners do not have to be friends. They have to be professional. True. Now, can we call the propaganda a dangerous tool? Propaganda is an issue. It can be useful for morale terms, but it's part of the morale battle. It needs to be viewed through that lens. Dear I'm glad to hear I'm not the only one who's singing along. It was a nice opening theme tune. It felt more like a pop song than a Star Trek opening number. But you know, No, they didn't have Makos. O'Brien served with intelligence groups, but he didn't serve with ground forces. They were using Starfleet personnel as the ground troops. They were drafting them in. Because, I've been through Starfleet training and ground forces. No, you haven't. In the nicest way. Yes, Starfleet self-defense and combat training is one of the most advanced combat training in the world. No, you are trained to fight on a ship. You will maybe act as a quick landing force in terms of raiding and command. That is very different than fighting an actual pitched battle on the land. That is a different skill set. It is different to fight when you cannot maneuver. It's a completely different brain set. There is a reason you do not take colonels from the army and stick them in charge of a ship if you want the ship to be fine. And there's a reason you don't usually take captains from the navy and stick them in charge of land forces. They can do the jobs in a pinch, yes, but they're not really the best at it, because if they meet someone of equivalent level but are specialists in what they do, then they're going to be in trouble because they won't think the right way. Because they've spent their entire lives being trained to think how to fight a ship rather than how to fight a land battle, or how to fight a land battle rather than how to fight a ship. Their rules are different. Is the British 100,000-ton Super Lion class design insane? I'd like to see the infrastructure support it. No worries, Stafford. The only reason I remember that about O'Neill is because he served with all sorts of things. That was basically one of the few things he hadn't served with an organisation of Makos, which would have been quite useful. Although, frankly, O'Neill is probably, in the nicest way, again, this is one of the things I like about SG9. No. Yeah. Is it SG9? Deep Space Nine, DS9. Sorry, I was getting Stargate and Deep Space Nine and confused. DS9. Is that actually O'Neill is probably the most developed non-officer character in Star Trek history in terms of Starfleet personnel, and is probably the most proficient soldier and combat fighter they've had. And he's an engineer. He's picked up those skills by actually being in combat. That's how he's had to learn them. He hasn't been taught them, really. He's picked them up by surviving, by fighting and living, and doing some very nasty things on behalf of Starfleet. That is not the way. That is that in the nicest way. Then think about it. O'Neill is the guy who pretty much the one person who can keep Deep Space Nine running, who can keep all that engineering going, and you're having to send him to combat leadership roles in the front line, in charge of infantry, because he's also the guy. So basically, you have your chief engineer, your senior specialist, warrant officer, is also your infantry sergeant major. Those should be two roles. Your infantry sergeant major is very important, very special, very useful for leading your infantry. You don't want anyone else doing that. But using your senior engineering NCO for that role, this is a very expensive person to replace. It's not easy to replace this one, but it's a lot more difficult to replace this one. And if you combine those two roles and they're doing it, that can be a very, very expensive person to lose. Okay, yes, if he's in charge of security, if he's in charge of doing stuff on Deep Space Nine, then that's fine. If he ends up in a fight, he's very useful. He's going to help secure the station for you. He makes sense there. But actually deploying him on Defiant and sending him down in infantry? And there's a very different, very much thing but if you consider Deep Space Nine and the whole history of that, when they're doing the joint operation with the Dominion troops in terms of hunting down the gateways, there is the fact that O'Brien is very much contrasted with the leader of the Dominion soldiers. And it's very much, these are the two, and then there's the Dominion sort of overseer, ambassador, politician, Wayunish type person. And there is Cisco. So they're the two commanders, and then below them, there's their two troop leaders, the Prime and Chief O'Brien. You sit there and go, that's not what you should be using the Chief for. Yes, he's good at it. Yes, he's going to do it very well. But that's not what he should be being used for, because he's an incredibly expensive, useful person to try and replicate the capabilities and abilities of. Yeah, I was mixing up O'Neill and O'Brien, wasn't I? Sorry. No, I know. Sorry, I mixed up O'Neill and O'Brien. I do apologise. This is the trouble with talking about so many O's. And as O'Neill with one, I should be clarifying O'Neill with two L's versus one L. Starfleet Ground Forces. We never see them in the actual programs, though, do we? And also, there's an interesting quote, and I do remember this because I've looked at this before. They expanded to 200. They expanded 250,000 personnel, but they managed to lose 105,000 soldiers during the war. So basically, they lost almost 50% of their pre-war force had been 200,000. So they lost more than 50% of their pre-war force. Yeah. And as said, you don't see them being used. There's the big effort when you actually see them being employed. There's the point where you should see them when they're defending the outpost, which is a listening post. That should have been defended by ground forces. Where are the personnel, though? No, they're personnel drafted from ships. There's a disconnect between the source book, which is the Dominion War source book, and the actual Starfleet shows, Star Trek shows. That's on. Hello, Melanie6040. Hello, Geek. South Johnson always wanted the SG-1 to have a group of SAS soldiers. It was interesting. There were Russians and others, but there were no British ones. I wonder if that was a decision made by the by the showrunners, despite how popular it was in the UK. Mm. Unless I think you could design a super line on UAD. I might design something like that. I've got a stack of UAD videos actually stacked up already for a couple of weeks, so I'm not going to do any more on UAD for a couple of weeks. I'm going to work on the regular videos. Gross Nazi, yes, they have shown. They could have shown more of the ground forces. Maybe have shown them alone one day. That would have been good. But honestly, again, as I said, the ground forces in the ground forces doctrine in Star Trek seems to be so. Again, 200,000 starting war, raised to 250,000 during the war, and yet they have 105,000 casualties. How many planets make up the Federation? How many? Just no. No. I know they're relying on the Starfleet security to protect these things, but. Anyway, right then. I'm going to say good evening to everyone and take care because it is now 9:45. But I'll finish off asking the remainder of the questions. Richards. You are going. There are cousins watching, and Stafford is also watching, and Stafford is very good. You're luckier. Sean usually by this point, and we all love Sean, but Sean by this point will usually have muted you for 3 minutes. Stafford doesn't like to use the mute button unless he has to. Ryan. Vision, Star Wars, despite its flaws, world building is better throughout than Star Trek in many ways. We know far more about how the governance of the Republic Empire worked than the Federation. True. Ryan, take care. I will echo Stafford's point on that one, Richard. Thank you, Jack Ray. Thank you, Vision. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you, Richards, for watching. Thank you, Christopher Ryan. Is there ever any body armor in Star Trek? Again! That's the personal shielding units, anyone? All sorts of options they could have come up. Thank you, DG40. Thank you, Dirt Scott. Thank you, John Shea. Thank you, Nancy40. After the classic trilogy, the geeks at West End Games sat down and made the Imperial Sourcebook. Probably some of them had military background, or at least military history background. Thanks, Rosowski. Thank you, Alzowski. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you for all your work this evening. Thank you, Early Sage. Thank you, Daniel Hammer. Thank you, Ryan Cash. Shouldn't a 100,000-ton Superlion have a bigger air battery than 32 pom-poms, 32 Bofors, and 24 Orcons? Yeah, but it depends how many dual-purpose guns they mount. Right. Thank you, Montaza Slavic. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And let's quickly go to see what we've got coming up. As it's the end. Right now, next week we have, in terms of long patrols, we have the Königsberg class, which I'm re-recording in tomorrow. On the 15th of March, we have the Glorious Heritage class. And I will say this now, okay? On the 20th of March, we are supposed to have Brewship 75. But if people like the Glorious Heritage class enough, I will do a live based on the Glorious Heritage class, discussing their roles and the Andromeda series and the whole sort of Andromeda universe thing. So, the Glorious Heritage class are coming out on the 15th. If you would like us to do a live discussion of that on the 20th, then please comment below it when it comes out in 15th. Next week is going to be the Königsberg class, and of course, next week's lives are going to be the Battle of Agathis on the 10th of March, and on the 11th of March, Operation Tan number 2. It's going to be fun. Right. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you've enjoyed. And I will just echo Stafford. Yes, be nice about Romy.